This is Katrin with Disability Rights New York. Welcome to our podcast, Empire State of Rights Closed Captioned. We are here to bring you information on the most relevant topics regarding disability rights and advocacy. Today we welcome Erica Molina, the CAP and PABSS Program Director at Disability Rights New York. She's here to discuss DRNY's new Committee on Advancing Racial Equality, the C.A.R.E Task Force. Erica, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Katrin. I'm very happy to be here.
Well, we've started this task force a couple of months ago, and I'd love for you to tell our audience what our C.A.R.E Task Force is and what are our mission and goals.
Sure, I'd be happy to. The C.A.R.E Committee started a few months ago, as you said, as a result of a lot of strife and a lot of difficult conversations that so many of us have been trying to have around the country. One of the things that we thought was important here at DRNY was that we bring together a group of people who really felt committed to asking the tough questions, having those tough conversations, and making change, not only in our own individual lives, but in the work that we do and in our communities.
And so I want to let our audience members know that I'm also a member of the task force and working on some of these tough conversations that we're having, Erica. I feel like we've really stepped into a new space around this conversation, specifically on the heels of the George Floyd murder and the subsequent events that have happened beyond that. So as we talk about the creation of this task force, can you talk to the audience a little bit about how we went about creating it and why it was created and the importance of it, not only internally in our organization, but how it affects us externally through our organization as well?
So C.A.R.E was really formed to help address, through our work here at Disability Rights New York, the racial inequalities that we've seen. One of the things that became very apparent after the George Floyd murder especially was that everybody had something to say. Everybody wanted to be part of the conversation. I think that it's important to note by the time the George Floyd murder happened in very late May, we at DRNY had been working from home statewide for about 2.5 months by then. We're used to seeing each other in person. We're used to being able to visit one another's offices and kind of talking in that way about the latest events or what's really important to us and what's going on, even if it's not necessarily related to our work at that very moment. So the directors here at DRNY really wanted to check in with our staff with so much going on around the country just because of the pandemic and then these newest events. We really thought it was important that the staff have a voice, not only with us one-on-one, but as a family, as a group here at DRNY. So very soon after, in very early June, we had an all-staff meeting, and I believe here at DRNY we're about 60 or 65 staff strong. And what we were able to do was have everybody in on this staff meeting remotely, online. And what I was able to do was and I was honored to do so, was to start the conversation. How is everybody feeling? What does everybody think about what's going on right now? The fact that we're isolated, the fact that all this strife is going on right outside our windows, it feels like. And what do you want to do about it? It was a very important conversation for DRNY to have. Many, many staff were very brave in speaking up and sharing. And I think even those who didn't necessarily share vocally were very brave just to sit there and to listen to their colleagues' thoughts and positions about everything that's going on. And as a result of those conversations, we thought that it was important not to lose momentum in what we were hearing. And what we were hearing was that what we wanted was to take some sort of action. What can we do to help? What can we do to make sure that DRNY is in a very meaningful way, taking a stance on racial equality and exactly what that means for our communities and our clients, as well as internally here for our own staff. And as a result of that initial all staff meeting, we formulated the idea of having a team to respond to those types of systemic issues such as racism and racial inequality, etc. And the C.A.R.E team was formed out of that, and I'm very grateful that it was.
Eric, I think you bring up so many good points. The remoteness of our organization and how we are now working in our own homes or spaces and not able to come together as we normally do. And I believe that other organizations have similar feelings, those who have been working remotely as we have for the past several months, and not being able to acknowledge one another physically and check in with each other on how we're doing. I think is such an important part of how C.A.R.E is now addressing some of those things, specifically around what you said. The question is, what can we do now? What can we do as we are observing all that's going on outside of our homes and our office space, and whether or not we can actually get involved, based on what's happening with the pandemic. So I do think that C.A.R.E is addressing that for us in certain ways. And let's talk about what it is that the team is currently working on. How has the team decided to, hold on to that momentum and really continue to move the conversation and the listening forward?
That's a great question, Katrin. We thought that it was very important not only to think about ways that we can act outward in the community and as an organization, but also internally, and reflecting on who DRNY is and what it means to work here and who we are. So one of the first steps that we did take was to have a meeting, come together and discuss some larger ideas of some goals. And in that came some actions that we have since taken and continue to take moving forward. So one of the things that we're trying to make sure that we are doing as an organization is to remain vocal about different issues that are going around in the country. So, for example, since the George Floyd murder, not only have other incidents around the country similar to that have happened, but others that have actually taken place earlier and before the George Floyd murder have actually been brought to light. So whenever one of these incidents actually take place or they're brought to light nationally, and even sometimes when they take place in our own state here in New York, we find it very important now to step up and to pipe up, really. So our executive director here, Tim Clune, will release and has been releasing statements in response to the different incidents that have been going on. That includes the finding of only one police officer having been indicted in relation to the Breonna Taylor murder, but of course that officer was not indicted for incidents or for events leading directly to her death. They were actually not related to her death at all. So, for example, we did put out a statement specifically having to do with that injustice. Another example is that back in March, here in New York, in Rochester, we learned recently that Daniel Prude was killed as a result of confrontation with the Rochester Police Department. We felt it very, very important, especially given the fact that Daniel Prude had been a person with mental illness. We thought it very important to say and to release to the public a statement saying how unacceptable it is how people with mental illness, and particularly Black men with mental illness, are treated by the police department or can be treated by the police departments. So we released a statement after learning about that incident, and we also wrote to the mayor and to the head of city council as well. We're also seeking places at the table with regard to other initiatives around the state. So, for example, similarly, as a result of the injustices around the country that have recently come to light, the New York Bar Association, again here in the state, has formed something called the Police Misconduct and Racial Inequality Task Force. And one of the things that we thought was important was to learn what that particular task force was planning on doing, and making sure that people with disabilities were at the table and that their voice could be heard. And for that reason, we were able to advocate for ourselves here at Disability Rights New York, and we got to see it at the table. I'm happy to say that we are currently represented at the task force. Other actions that we've been able to take internally here at DRNY have included having very important conversations among ourselves with our teams on a smaller level. And something that we just recently did was have a very important discussion about Indigenous Peoples Day. So the C.A.R.E committee was able to organize that, and I was able to lead a very robust conversation talking about Indigenous Peoples Day, why DRNY felt it was important to highlight Indigenous Peoples Day as opposed to Columbus Day. And it was a really, really enlightening conversation that would not have happened had C.A.R.E not been available to us as a tool through which we could have those types of conversations.
Erica, you're working on so much right now, and a couple of things I want to just touch on. Some of our audience members may not really understand what being at the table means for us here. I think that there's a lot of conversation and there's a lot of things that happen, whether it's within organizations or outside of organizations, where not everyone is available to give their voice to, whether it's an issue or ongoing issues. And, we talk about intersectionality a lot. It's everywhere that you're reading any kind of article. And I'm not sure that there's enough emphasis on that, on what it means to be at the table for important conversations, understanding the realities of intersectionality and how, whether it's policy or decisions that are being made with those who are affected, not inside the room, how those decisions end up not really being available to all the people that need to, whether they're affected by a certain decision or affected by a certain policy. If they're not at the table, their voice can't be heard. Talk to us a little bit about what it means to really be at the table, to understand intersectionality, and how having your voice heard, whether you're representing yourself or a specific community, is crucial when it comes to making decisions in policy.
It's incredibly important that the concept of intersectionality taken into account whenever talking about any issue that affects the Black community or any community of color. So one of the things that people who may not fully grasp what intersectionality is or how it affects the present is there's never a straight or very clear answer or explanation as to why any particular racial injustice has happened in this country. People need to understand that racism as a construct is hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years old. It is not new to this country. It's not new to the 2000s. It's not new to the Black community at all, nor to other communities of color. And the thing is that racism itself would not function if it didn't have other aspects supporting it. It just wouldn't work. So one of the things that hopefully folks can understand why it is so important to be part of any structure that's trying to make change, trying to make decisions, being at the table, being a part of the conversation. It's important because the answers are never simple. The reason that Daniel Prude was killed in the way he was here in Rochester, New York, is not simply because the police officers who responded to the call for help, it's not only because they were trained in a certain way, maybe they did act exactly as though they were trained. It's not because those officers were racist. It's not because those maybe who responded were acting against outright animus toward the individual. It's not necessarily because Daniel Prude was a veteran with PTSD that had gone untreated. It's not because of any of these one simple reasons. Disability itself is such a multi-layered issue. And the fact is that when you have a history that involves being a veteran, being someone who is Black in the United States, and someone who does have mental illness, and the fact that mental health resources are not readily available and not as readily available as those in the criminal response and criminal justice systems, those resources are available. Jail is available, but things such as needing a crisis counselor on call, having someone who was appropriately equipped to handle someone with very severe mental illness, that needs to be understood not only by the community at large, but it needs to be explained by people who understand the disabled community at large. And for Disability Rights New York and for other like-minded advocates not to be at these tables and not to be a part of these decisions that are being made about how to make things better, it's such an important thing that we be there, because to not be there only perpetuates the problem. It only adds to the oversimplification of it. And when that's the issue, even if the people around the table are truly seeking to be helpful and to have no animus or hard feelings toward anybody, for somebody like a person with a disability or a person representing people with disabilities not to be at the table means that they were already setting their solution up for failure. And that's why it's so important to understand intersectionality, being at the table, and when that table doesn't necessarily invite you to it, pushing yourself to it and, using your elbows and making your own chair and getting there in any way you can. That's what's important about being at the table.
Thank you so much for that response, Erica. There's so much we could talk about. I feel like we should probably have 3 or 4 more podcasts on just these subjects alone. And there's so much to learn about, not only within each organization, but all of what's going on in your community. Let's talk about how people can learn about what we're doing here at DRNY with C.A.R.E.
The community can learn about what we're doing here at C.A.R.E, at DRNY, by going to our webpage. If you go to www.drny.org, you can very easily look into the various different initiatives that we've been making through C.A.R.E, as well as the public statements that we've been putting out that I mentioned earlier during the podcast.
And we'll list that link in the description of this podcast. But before we sign off, do you have any final thoughts for our audience?
I do, Katrin, and thank you again for having me today. I think it's such an important set of initiatives here that we've done at DRNY. But the most important message that I could think to share with your listeners is that we all have a role to play. There's so much work to be done everywhere, every single day. And the only way that change really does happen is through action. So whether that's somebody picking up a book and learning more about how this country's voting system works, learning more about how the systems of racial oppression have been designed to function and how they're informing that today, I think it's important for folks to sign up and to receive newsletters or to go to meetings in their community, town halls, having to do with the vote, having to do with racial equality, having to do with police brutality and related injustices. There's just so many opportunities out there that people can even do and actions that they can take even while working from home, even while being home and safely socially distanced from others around you during this pandemic. Very important to know that you can do work, even just where you are with what you have. You just need to find some tools to work with. And I really do believe that it's everybody's job to learn a little bit more and to do what they can.
That's great advice, Erica. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Katrin. It was a pleasure being here.
Empire State of Rights Closed Captioned has been brought to you by Disability Rights New York, your source for disability rights and advocacy. If you enjoyed our program, make sure to subscribe, like, and share this post. If there is a subject you would like us to discuss, please email podcast@drny.org or comment below. Tune in next Wednesday, where we'll bring you more information on disability rights in the state of New York. The closed captioned and ASL version of this podcast is available on our YouTube channel. To listen to more Empire State of Rights closed captioned, follow us on Apple Podcasts and Spotify.